Dungeons and Dragons is built around certainty. The system assumes that characters will gradually gain power and control over the world around them. They gain abilities, they acquire resources, they become increasingly capable of solving any problem placed in front of them. And that structure works extremely well for heroic fantasy. But horror depends on something very different. Horror depends on instability. It depends on uncertainty. It depends on situations where the characters and the players cannot fully understand what is happening around them. When the world becomes predictable, fear changes shape. It becomes tactical. And once fear becomes tactical, sustained dread becomes very difficult to maintain. Over time, players learn something about the structure of the game. They learn that every situation is usually manageable. Every monster is really just a bag of stats. Every trap has a solution. And every mystery has an answer that can eventually be uncovered. When players trust that the situation is solvable, their behavior begins to change. Instead of asking, what is happening, they begin asking, what is the best way we can defeat this? The shift is subtle, but it transforms the emotional atmosphere of the table. Curiosity replaces dread. Strategy replaces uncertainty. And the unknown slowly becomes just another problem to solve. Over the years, I've run several games in many different editions of D&D featuring a very famous vampire. They all start the same way. Early on, when there's no chance of them defeating the vampire, they always have an encounter with him. They're usually frozen in fear. They know just how close to death they really are. But over time, they begin to level up. They gain power and equipment and magic. And soon, they relish their next encounter with him. You see, he's no longer an existential threat. He's just another obstacle to overcome. Fear changes shape once players believe the world is manageable. At first, the unknown creates hesitation. Players move carefully. They speculate about what might be happening. But once they believe the situation has a solution, fear becomes tactical. Instead of asking what the world is doing, players begin asking, how do we overcome the world? And when fear becomes tactical, sustained dread becomes very difficult to maintain. Running horror in Dungeons and Dragons does not require abandoning the system, but it does require changing how certainty operates at the table. Instead of escalating threats, the goal becomes narrowing guarantees. The players are still capable. Their characters are still very powerful. But the world itself becomes harder to interpret. This usually comes in three forms. It comes when information becomes incomplete, when success becomes partial, and when consequences last longer than players expect. Each of these changes the emotional condition of the game. players begin to hesitate. They question whether they truly understand what is happening. And that hesitation creates space for dread. You see, in one of those vampire campaigns, players found a note from one of the town elders. He was the father of one of the NPCs who they had grown to like and trust. It outlined for them where a powerful artifact was hidden and exactly how to get it without bringing ruin on the village. They took this note and ran with it. They followed the directions to a T. What they didn't realize was that the father was under the sway of the vampire. And this led them to do exactly what he wanted. They never thought that someone they trusted could have a father that would betray them so completely. They sat there stunned. That particular party never trusted anyone again in that campaign. You see, horror rarely comes from stronger enemies. It usually comes from reduced certainty, when information is incomplete, when answers raise new questions, when the players suspect they may already be misunderstanding the situation, when the world becomes harder to interpret. And acting without full clarity is where dread begins to appear. Many attempts at horror focus on escalation. Stronger monsters, deadlier encounters, more grotesque imagery. But damage does not create lasting dread. Damage creates urgency. Information creates dread. When players act without understanding what is truly happening around them, every decision they make becomes uncertain. They begin to question their assumptions. They wonder if they've already misinterpreted the situation. And once doubt enters the table, even ordinary choices begin to carry weight. A simple decision becomes risky when the players are no longer sure they understand the rules of the situation. Have you ever had a party that just blew through a dungeon, kicking down every door without a care in the world? Have you ever introduced a mimic to that party? See, the mimic isn't super powerful, but it has a reason why it's in dungeons. It makes players unsure. You see, once the party is unsure as to whether a door is really a door, things change. Suddenly, opening a door becomes a 10-step process because they've learned that what they thought they knew was not true anymore. Many horror attempts to focus on damage, deadlier enemies, harder encounters. But damage creates urgency, not dread. Information itself, or the lack thereof, creates dread. When players act without truly understanding what is happening, every decision they make becomes uncertain. And uncertainty is what allows fear to linger. Even with careful constraint, Dungeons & Dragons naturally drifts towards heroism. Characters grow stronger, their abilities expand, threats eventually become manageable. The trajectory is part of the system's design. And that design is one of the reasons the game is so enjoyable. But sustained existential dread usually requires systems where erosion is built directly into the mechanics. Recognizing this difference allows game masters to make more deliberate choices about tone. You can run horror in Dungeons and Dragons, but the goal cannot simply be to increase the level of danger. The more important goal becomes something simpler. How certain are your players about the world they are in? Because horror does not come from danger alone. It comes from acting in a world that no longer feels fully understandable.